And now I typically write urban fantasy, supernatural thrillers. Writing for 16 years, I have 47 books to my name, 8 languages worldwide, and hopefully I'll do this for another 16 plus and triple that number. Finally, as Craig mentioned, I'm the creator with Nick Stevenson of your first 10K Readers fame. You guys know Nick? Yes. Okay. He and I partnered together to put together the Story Engines course, which takes all this story structure stuff and boils it down into an easy way to take it. So what's my story? I never wanted to be a writer. You know, most of you guys probably said, I want to write something when I was a young kid. I've been writing stories since I was 8. Nope, none of that stuff for me. I have a degree in Soviet studies, of all things. Absolutely useless. Who knows what I was thinking? I wrote my first novel, Riverwatch, on a dare in college to win a case of beer. I had just finished reading one of Margaret Truman's, Murder at the White House, Murder at the Senate, that series she had back in the 80s. I absolutely hated it, threw it across the room. Apparently I wouldn't shut up about it because my roommate finally said, all right, I'll bet you a case of Bass Ale that you can't write a book. Never mind write a book that's actually readable or anything. So my job at school was to work in a little security booth on the far side of campus from midnight to 8 a.m. several nights a week. So I sat there with legal pads and I wrote an entire novel. No idea what I was doing. I broke every rule in the book because I was too stupid to know there were rules. I just wrote. That manuscript sat in a shoebox for 11 years after I left school. My wife found it when we got married. She asked if she could read it and then said, hey, you should try to do something with this. So we took that longhand manuscript, we typed it up, we submitted it to 5 publishers, one of whom was Simon & Schuster. They bought it right out of the blocks. That kicked off my career. They did a 2-book deal, and I thought, hey, success. I can do this thing. This is great. I don't have to slave away at a day job anymore. Except, not really. I didn't sell another thing after those first 2 books for 3 straight years. I remember this is back in the days before Amazon Kindle and all this stuff, 2002 to 2005 or so. It totally crippled me. I thought I was a complete hack. I had, no idea what I was doing. And remember, I broke all those rules because I didn't know there were rules, so I was convinced I couldn't write. I thought that those 2-book deal was just pure dumb luck, Book 2, which was called The Heretic at that time, was the first book in what is now an internationally best-selling urban fantasy series, but my editor left Simon & Schuster the week before the book hit the market. So in traditional publishing terms, that means I was orphaned. I didn't have an in-house champion to help me push the book and get everything out on time and make sure it was a success. So this 50,000 copy print run sold about 5,000 copies. That's not good. And in traditional publishing, you're only as good as your last book. Those sales will follow you every time you try to sell something new. So the editors will go and look up, how'd your last book do? Wow, that book tanked. And so I had a really hard time selling anything. So I knew something had to change, but I didn't know what. So I went to work trying to figure it out. I read everything I could get my hands on, trying to see, well, what made this book work versus that book, and so on. I watched TV and films till my butt hurt from sitting on the couch, and that's a lot of film watching, let me tell you. I tried to decide, what it was that was present throughout multiple genres. What are the things that were common, whether I'm writing a romance story, whether I'm writing a horror story, or anything in between. And then I went back to the basics. What do they have in common? How do I map those out? I picked out about 12 different books that were kind of my favorites and mapped them out scene by scene, trying to see, okay, where do these things go together and what are their commonalities? And then I took the best of that, created a structure system, a plot system, and then went back to work trying to sell books. Thankfully, I did something right, because suddenly I had a career. I sold a 3-book urban fantasy series to Tor. I did a 4-book zombie apocalypse series to Harvard Voyager. I did 10 or 12 action-adventure series in the Rogue Angel line for Harlequin Gold Eagle. So things were picking up. I also went from writing 1 book a year to writing 5 more. And part of that was giving myself just the benefit of writing the way that worked for me. Because I'm one of those crazy folks that don't write books in order. So I don't write chapter 1, then chapter 2, then chapter 3. I'll write chapter 44, and then chapter 5, and then chapter 13. And so allowing myself the freedom to write that way unleashed the creativity in my brain, but it also meant I had to be better organized about what was going into my story. How is that story strung together? Because if I don't know that from the start, there's no way I could jump around like that. So that was really key to helping me get moving forward. And the structure piece is what allowed me to do that. Then when the rights reverted to my earlier books from Simon & Schuster, I put them back out. This is 2010 when the Kindle publishing just kind of got off the ground. And I've been going on since then. So that sophomore book that totally flopped, well, the rights actually sold to Germany. That one hit the Dromer-Nauer bestseller list at number 52. Its 2 sequels hit the list at higher, 45 and 40. Sold each book over 300,000 copies. I was doing okay. I was happy. There's the original. There's the latest edition, 5th edition or so of the book in the last 16 years. So, okay. What did I learn through that? Well, one of the key things that really struck me is we are actually literally wired for story. Neurologically, we respond to information far better when it is told in a story form than it is when it is told as straight facts. You know, Brian was up here yesterday talking about bringing everything back to character. Why are we bringing it back to character? Because character is the heart of your story. And so we relate to information better if it's presented in story form. You know, we've been telling stories since we sat around a campfire as cavemen, you know, worried about what was out in the dark. And so for thousands of years, we have told stories in a kind of particular way. And we have gotten used to hearing stories in this way. So it's become ingrained in us to look and respond to stories that are told in that fashion. When we get those stories like that, when we receive information in that way, the empathy we have for the characters in the stories increases. And the more empathy you have, the better your reader is hooked in. I mean, why do readers pick up books? They want an emotionally powerful experience, right? They want to take that journey with the character and go along with them. And so the more you can do to hook them in on an emotional level, the stronger the book will feel. Has anybody ever read a book, gotten maybe a third of the way through, and then just got bored with it? Right? You know, most of us, right? Or how about you start a book, and you're like a chapter, 2 chapters in, and you're like, what the heck is going on? Who are these people? You know, you can't connect to any of the characters. You know, that's a function of a lack of emotional connection, which 99.9% of the time is a problem with the inherent story structure of the story. And what do I mean by story structure? The way you tell the story, the process in which you relate that tale. As I said, story structure, the way you deliver it is key. Okay, so Nick and I surveyed thousands of people in his Your First 10K Readers course. And we asked them what were some of the major struggles that they experienced when they were writing. You can see the top 5 here. Planning, plotting, story structure was number 1. And hot on the heels of that was time and writing speed. Because those 2 things kind of go together. If you know what you're writing, you know where you're going with the story, you inherently write faster. So combine those 2 things, we had almost 80% of the problems that people were experiencing. So that's why kind of what we're focusing on today is those 2 things combined. I posit that 99% of story problems start with structure. When you can nail the structure of your story, when the right things happen at the right time, the writing process gets a heck of a lot easier. And that's the structure that I teach in my course and what we're going to talk about today. All right, so that's all the introduction stuff. Let's get into the meat, dirty, gritty, nitty-gritty of this stuff. The Story Engine Blueprint, my story structure process, came about through a combination of looking at all those processes that are out there. You know, 3-act structure from Aristotle, 4-act structure, 5-act structure from television writing. It's kind of an amalgam of all that and Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, and you've all heard of these things, right? Not crazy? Okay, so What is that process? And you have handouts in your folders to kind of keep this together for you. The essential elements are 4 phases. I don't care if you call them stages, I don't care if you call them acts, I don't care if you call them phases, whatever. There are 4 things that happen. There's a preparation phase, a reactive phase, a proactive phase, and a conclusion phase. And we're going to talk about each of those in specific in a minute. Connecting those, the darker blue on the chart, are what I call game-changing moments. They're the key hinge story elements of your story that drive the hero further into the tale. Every blockbuster story on the planet can be broken down in this way. And in fact, we've got a cheat sheet in a couple minutes that takes a book from most of the primary genres: romance, thrillers, science fiction, fantasy. We even did a short story to show it applies to short stories, and breaks them down into each of these 7 elements so you can see how this is applied in real life. And I always get, I'm dating myself for my Danger Will Robinson thing here. Remember Lost in Space, the big robot? Wandering away from this structure, it's a kind of inherent risk because we are looking for this structure subconsciously when we read. So if you wander away from it, it makes it more difficult. Let's talk about the elements in general. Preparation phase, first 20-25% of your story. It sets up the tale. So it introduces the hero, it introduces the setting, and it introduces the story problem or the conflict inherent in the tale. Every story has a question that needs to be answered by the time you get to the end. That's the thing the reader wants to know. And I call it a story problem. So connecting that right after the preparation phase is game changer number 1. This is that point in the story where something happens to the hero. And I'm going to use hero and villain. You don't have to use those terms. You can say opposition or protagonist and antagonist. Hero and villain is just easier to do. So something happens to the hero that takes them from their average everyday life and spins them off on a new track, moves them into a new journey. That's game changer number 1. The next phase is where the hero reacts to that event. And they really don't know what's going on at this point. It's kind of like a chicken with their head cut off. They're just kind of running around, doing things, but they don't really know why or haven't stopped to think about it. Anybody read Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code? Okay, or seen the movie for that matter? Okay. So when Langdon goes on the run, he has absolutely no idea what he's doing. He's just reacting to events that happen to him. He is not in control. That's a great example of the reactive phase. They're just doing things because things are happening to them. But then along comes game-changing moment number 2. And in that moment, the hero learns something about the opposition, about the antagonist. They understand who they are and what they want. And more importantly, they understand that the goals of that individual or thing is diametrically opposed to their own goals. So they're in conflict with each other now. If one wins, the other fails. And that's really key. You can't have a story without conflict. So game changer number 2 lays out that conflict for both the reader and for the hero. They understand what's happening. And that allows you to move into the proactive phase. They're proactively working to stop the opposition. They are trying to gain their goals and, by essence, stop the villain from succeeding in their own goals. And finally, game changer number 3, the hero gets the final piece of the puzzle. They understand exactly what they have to do to bring the battle to the villain one final time. And of course, that leads into your conclusion where everything gets neatly wrapped up. The hero either succeeds or fails. So, 7 key elements of every successful story, 4 phases tied together by 3 game-changing moments. So let's look at a story to see how those actually apply. I'm going to use a film just because it's easier for the purposes of discussion, but the original Star Wars film, A New Hope. Preparation phase, with Luke Skywalker on Tatooine, the droids arrive, he finds the message from Princess Leia, and he goes in search of Ben Kenobi. Okay, we've set up the story, we've introduced the hero, we've introduced the setting, and we've sent our hero moving on a new journey. Game changer number 1. Luke finds Ben. Ben agrees to help him. They come back to Luke's home where Luke is supposed to stay. He wasn't going to go with Ben. But they discover that the house has been destroyed, his aunt and uncle are dead, there is nothing left of his day-to-day life. So Luke moves on in a new direction. It pushes him into a new kind of quest or adventure. So that brings us into the reactive phase. That point in the film from when they leave Tatooine and they end up on the Death Star and they rescue Leia from the garbage compactor and they're running around and just trying to get off the Death Star, that's the reactive phase. Because our hero isn't in control. What's he doing? He's following Han around, he's following Leia around, he's taking orders from Ben Kenobi. He is not doing anything active to drive him forward in his goal. And then comes game changer number 2. Darth Vader kills Obi-Wan. And all of a sudden our hero has agency. He is on his own, and he steps up and starts to direct some of the action that takes place from that point forward. He is proactively working towards a goal that he believes in, which is the destruction of the Death Star and the defeat of Darth Vader. So, that's the proactive phase. They escape from the Death Star. They get to the Rebel base. They have a big conference. They decide they have to attack the Death Star no matter what, because the thing's got to be destroyed. Game changer number 3. That final piece of the puzzle that lets the hero take one all-or-nothing attempt to get his goal is the fact that they discover there's that little exhaust port that if you drop a photon torpedo in, it'll destroy the whole Death Star. So that's what they need to take the battle to the enemy one final time, which they do. And of course, they destroy the Death Star. Luke makes the shot. We all know the story. All right, so those are the 7 elements all put together in a story that I hope most of you are familiar with. I should have asked that earlier. And you can see how they play together. All right, speed up here. Cheat sheet time. Cheat sheet time. There we go. Please write down this link because the one in your packet is wrong. We had to change it last night at the last minute. So it's www.yourfirst10kreaders.com/story structure. This takes these stories, Me Before You, Tripwire, Hound of the Baskervilles, Child's End, Sword of Shannara, Hillbilly Elegy, which by the way is narrative nonfiction, so it's a little different. Dracula, The Great Gatsby, and what was the last one? A short story by Asimov. Short, it's 30 pages, but it's still short. Okay, everybody got that? I can move? Yes. Okay. So, this being NaNoWriMo month, a lot of the questions I've gotten recently is, well, how do I apply all this to write a book in 30 days? How can I speed up my process if it normally takes me 2 years to write a book? So, we're going to talk for the next couple minutes about this 4-step story validation process, this system that I use to write all of my books since number 2. And it's first, take an idea, turn it into a premise, build your characters, build your conflict, and then lay out a story list or outline. I'll address, who in here is a plotter? Okay, that means most of you are pantsers, is that right? Pants, yeah. Okay, so a pantser is someone who writes by the seat of the pants. They don't plan out their story ahead of time. Plotter is planning everything. I told you I don't write stories in order. I write whatever chapter I feel like writing today and then kind of build bridges later on. So if I didn't know every single scene in my story before I start my process, I couldn't move forward. That is not to say that outlining is the only way that you can use to write a story. But I will ask those pantsers in the room to not brush it off entirely, because even having a vague roadmap for where you are going is better than winging it in the dark, because it allows you to hit those key elements that let you engage the reader and bring them on a powerful emotional experience. Okay, so bear with me. All right, ideas are everywhere. Coming up with an idea isn't a problem. It's coming up with the right idea that is going to work, sell you books, and make you money. So how do we figure that out? How do we know which one is going to work? And when I say idea, I just mean, this vague kind of statement. I'm going to write a book about a baseball player. I'm going to write an urban fantasy novel. I'm going to write a story about tech pages. Whatever it is. It's just kind of a general idea or concept. But then you have to take that idea and turn it into a premise. what is a premise? Well, number one, a premise validates that idea. It tells you if it can support the story that you want to write. And number two, it's just a short summary of what your book is about. A good premise has to include your hero, it has to include the story problem, and it has to include the stakes. Okay? If it includes the villain or opposition, you kind of get bonus points. That's a really good one. So, if you've never sat down and tried to write a premise, and this is the answer to that question when you get on an elevator and the guy next to you says, "What's your book about?" Or as happened to me, I got on an elevator and the executive editor of HarperCollins said, "What's your book about?" And I needed a really good answer because that was my shot to get in the door at the time. So, a little formula, kind of cheating way of doing this really quickly, is book name is about character who must, some goal that they have to achieve in order to deal with the stakes in the opposition. Okay? So, I showed you The Heretic, number 2 book that I wrote way back in 2003. The premise for The Heretic. The Heretic is about a modern Templar knight who must retrieve an ancient artifact from the powerful necromancer before it can be used to create hell on earth. Short, sweet, to the point. I can say that in a single sentence, and the person I'm talking to should know what my book is about pretty easily. The character is a Templar knight. It doesn't have to be a specific name. Just keep it general. This is what I'm writing about. The goal is retrieving an ancient artifact, happens to be the spirit of Longinus. The opposition, the powerful necromancer. And the stakes, we're trying to avoid hell on earth. That's not a good thing. We don't want that. So here's some premises from some other stories you're probably familiar with. Jaws by Peter Benjamin. When a great white shark starts attacking beachgoers in a coastal town during high tourist season, a water-phobic sheriff must assemble a team to hunt it down before it kills again. Silence of the Lambs by Tom Harris. A young female FBI trainee must barter personal information with an imprisoned psychopath in order to catch a serial killer who is capturing and killing young women for their sins. Skins. And then Raiders of the Lost Ark. Big difference there, right? A treasure hunting archaeologist races over the globe to find the legendary Lost Ark of the Covenant before Hitler's minions can acquire and use it to supernaturally power the Nazi army. Quick, short little, these are sentences that say what your book is about. Now, if you started writing and you've gotten like a third of the way through the book and you've kind of petered out and you don't know where the story is going, I would suggest that this is your problem. You don't know what your story is actually about. You don't know what the premise of your tale is, so you don't know what direction to take your tale. Does that make sense? Okay. Introducing the opposition and the stakes brings conflict into your premise and brings conflict into your story. And that's incredibly important, because without conflict, A, your story is dull, and B, it's not really a story. It's a vignette. We're going to talk about that in a second. And the nice thing, you can use your premise later on to help you write your synopsis or your post description. Okay, so I've got a premise. Started with an idea, turned into a premise. I know what I'm writing about. Now I have to talk about those heroes and villains that I just mentioned in the premise. I have to develop them a little bit into character. So I always ask these 3 questions. What does the character want? And by that I mean, what is the specific goal they are trying to achieve by the end of the story? Go back to Star Wars: A New Hope. What's Luke's goal? It's not to rescue the princess. It's to destroy the Death Star. That's the final end point that he's working for. What drives the character towards that goal? What motivates them, pushes them emotionally to try to reach that end? And finally, how do they change during the course of the struggle? What do they learn? What do they discover about themselves? You've heard the term character arc all the time? That last question is character arc summed up in about 5 words. What are they learning as they move through the process? So, back to conflict for a minute. I said a story without conflict isn't a story. It's a slice of life. It's a vignette. It's a little window into something happening. But there's nothing driving that story emotionally. Therefore, it's not really a story. Conflict is what brings the story to life. And in order to have true conflict, your hero and your villain's goals must be diametrically opposed. I've worked with so many writers that come in and their hero has one goal and their villain's doing something else, and they're like ships passing in the night that never contact each other. That's not a story, folks, and nobody wants to read those stories. You know, and they have to be opposed because that's where you get the action inherent in the tale. If the hero succeeds, as I've said before, the villain has to fail. If the villain succeeds, the hero fails. I get this question a lot. What if I have multiple heroes? And a great example of this is Stephen King's The Stand. He's got like 12 characters or something. And they all have their own goals, and they're all doing something. Each of those characters must have their own storyline, must have their own conflict, must have their own goals, and they all need to be resolved by the time that you get to the end of the story. So, I've got my idea, my premise, my characters. How do I turn that into a story? Well, I'm kind of old-fashioned. I sit down and do, I kind of vomit on the page. I just write down every single scene that I can think of that has occurred to me as I've been working with these characters and this conflict idea. And I don't censor myself. I don't care if I know where it goes. I don't care if the scene sounds outlandish. It's Fonzie jumping the sharks. It just goes down on the card so I don't forget. And then what I'll do is I'll think about the scenes that have to be there. The introduction of the hero, the introduction of the conflict, the introduction of the villain, that whole setup section. Those all go down on cards. So by the time I'm done, I've got a stack of a bunch of cards that aren't really in order, that maybe don't connect to each other, but they're just scenes that I have thought of in relation to my novel. So when I say scene, I put them on index cards. You can use Scrivener or whatever. But here's an example. Quick, easy, short, to the point. Kate's presence in the reliquary sets off an arcane warning system. Set up by the Templars when they abandon the facility, and the squad of knights are dispatched to investigate. I know that doesn't mean anything to you, but it fits the story. And the point is, it's a scene I envisioned before I knew where it fit or how it went into my tale. So I just wrote it down on a scene card. Then I take all of those, and I start laying them out on the table. And I know I need a couple things, right? I need 4 phases. So I put all my setup scenes in one stack. I put all my reactive scenes in another stack. All my proactive scenes in a third. All my conclusion scenes in a fourth. I know I need my 3 game-changing moments. If I don't have those, I need to develop them right now. So I get those, and I have those in place. So I know how my stacks connect to each other. Then I start looking for scenes that I didn't think of. Okay, I know my character's going to be in a gun battle with, 5 other guys. But how do you get to the gun battle? And what happens after the gun battle? If I don't have those scenes, I know I have to add those into the process, so I start building up my scenes in a bigger list. And then I try to put them in sequential order. I've got a stack of 40 or 60 scene cards. I know where my game-changing moments are. Now I try to make them chronologically so they move through the process. That gives me my story as a whole. It also does a couple things. Number one, it tells you right away where your holes are. Where are my problems with my plot? Where are the things that I didn't think of that I now have to fix? Number two, it saves you on rewrites. Most of the students I have worked with, they say they're doing editing. They're not doing editing. Editing is fixing and polishing and making things neater. Rewriting is taking a third of the book and having to redo it because it doesn't make sense to the story. Doing this ahead of time eliminates rewrites. My first 2 novels, when I did use this process, I did 4 drafts, I think, of each. Since then, I've done 47 books, and I have not done more than 2 drafts. And that second draft is always just a polish. It's just, can I say this a little better? Can I make this a little prettier? Because I know ahead of time, I'm not going to get halfway through the book and realize, oh my gosh, I left this huge gaping plot hole, and now I have to fix it. A couple things to remember. Put your scenes in order based on your structure. You have to have a preparation phase. It's a big thing lately in like thriller movies where the action starts in the first 2 minutes and you're off and running, like the Liam Neeson Taken movies, and you jump into the action. The problem with that is the reader or the viewer, in the case of films, does not care about your hero because you haven't given them time to get close to the hero. So having a preparation phase where you're laying out the hero's day-to-day life allows your reader to emotionally connect to that person Therefore, when things all go to hell, they want to follow the story. They want to know what happens to those people. Game-changing moment should be around the 20 or 25% of your story. If it's too early, you lose some of that emotional connection. If it's too late, the reader gets bored. And last but not least, second to last, your hero has to be heroic. I can't say this enough. Your hero has to have agency. They have to be the individual that solves the problem, solves the crime, wins the day. If they are not, they're not your hero. They have to be the one who drives the action to its conclusion. And finally, the story problem. That central question in your tale has to be answered by the end of the book. At this point, you're ready to write. You got everything laid out, you can go on and hit it. I already talked about editing and rewriting, so you can skip this. Quick recap, 7 elements, 4 phases, 3 game-changing moments, and the 4-step process: idea, the premise, characters, conflict, finally into your series, outline, and scene list. We got like 2 minutes, maybe a little longer. He's standing up, so I know I'm running out of time. Questions from anybody? Go.
How does a prologue fit into this? Can you restate the question?
Sure, yeah. Sorry. So the question is, how does a prologue fit into this? Well, I'm a little old-fashioned. I tend to wonder what the purpose of prologues are. So, a prologue is usually designed to tell the reader something that occurs before the main action of the story. It's some fact that they need to make sense of everything that happens afterwards. So it would fit into the preparation phase, that setup process of the story. But it doesn't have any more real relevance than that. It's just another chapter in that section. That's the question.
So your book's structure obviously is very well thought out. How do you apply this to a series where you leave unanswered questions at the end of the book?
Sure. My Templar Chronicles series, modern Templar knights that battle the supernatural on behalf of the Vatican, was originally written as a trilogy. So I set up that structure across that trilogy so that the first book contained a lot of the setup elements of the story. The second book was kind of your reactive and proactive phase, and your third book was kind of your conclusion. I got to the end of that. I stopped writing that series for 5 years, and then all sorts of folks just kept writing in, when are you going to write another Templar book? When are you going to write another Templar book? I'm locked in Templar hell for the rest of my life. So I wrote another trilogy. And then I wrote a third trilogy, or I'm writing a third trilogy. We're going to end up with a 9-book series. And by the end of it, I will have 3 trilogies that each deal with the 7-element structure. And then through some careful planning, across 9 books, that whole structure is also applied. It's looser at that point because you're taking broad general concepts, but the structure still makes sense. And emotionally, your reader will be more tightly connected to your tale if you do it that way. Other questions? Go.
Yeah, I was just wondering, we're hearing so much about how you start with the action right away, start with the action. So how do you balance that?
I disagree with that entirely. Because if you start with the action, let me rephrase that. When they say start with the action, they want a hook. They want something that pulls the reader into the tale, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's your game-changing moment, inciting moment, inciting plot point. Those all mean the same thing. Those aren't often the very first thing that happens. Yes, you have to hook them, but you need that element to get them attached to your character before you can move on and do anything else. Yes?
How would you phrase your premise for romance?
Same thing I would do. In romance, you've got 2 characters that are essentially either moving towards each other or away from each other. So one's a hero, one's a villain, and start with the problem. Deal with the conflict. What are they going to do? What's at stake if they don't come together, if they don't end up in that happily ever after? And that's your premise. Go to the cheat sheet. The first one is romance. And if I remember correctly, we laid out the premises for each of them on top of the action. And I think we're out of time. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Joe, for a great presentation. Thank you. Next 15-minute breaks, 9 o'clock we will be up here with Michael Anderley and his collaborators talking about how you collaborate.